Welcome back to Many Minds Therapy Hub. Today we're going to talk about what the heck is EMDR.
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to this because three of us have experience treating EMDR, but I'm also excited, or we're also excited to have Vanessa, who doesn't treat utilizing EMDR, but she treats some of our clients who also are undergoing EMDR. So, yeah,
Yeah,
very
like
excited.
a partnership where if somebody comes in for whatever an injury claim, then one of us will be doing EMDR and Vanessa will be seeing them for psychotherapy. So I feel like it gives you kind of a unique perspective on it because you have like that like partnership view of it. But yeah, what is EMDR?
Yeah.
I think that that's a good place to start because I feel like it's a popular model, right? Like it's talked about more in social media, but like, what is it even?
Yeah. Should we go and start kind of from like its origin? What are your thoughts? Maybe a bit about the founder, Shapiro, and how I actually really enjoyed the story of the park because I feel like it's such a different way of like coming up with a modality to treat that is not like in a lab or just doing clinical trials, and just like she was walking in the park and she was under distress and noticed that bilateral stimulation or like bilateral movement of her eyes actually help reduce some of the distressing symptoms that she was experiencing, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
Right? Like just like watching the leaves fall, doing their thing, it was helpful for her, which is like so bizarre to even think
Mm-hmm.
of, right? Like who would think, oh, I'm watching the leaves and then wait a minute, I'm feeling better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm looking left, I'm looking right, I'm looking left, I'm looking right. Like, oh, weird. As I'm thinking about this is actually feeling better. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I'm curious about coming up. I think what's coming up for me is like a way of mindfulness. I don't want to like, because I know my brain also goes into like different places, but I also want to hear what Vanessa may have to say before we move on. And when we do mindfulness exercises, if we're like outdoors, some of like just the present moment and noticing can actually help reduce some symptoms. So I'm curious, Vanessa, I know you practice or utilize a lot of that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I don't practice EMDR. All in this group do practice EMDR. So I have a different experience where I get to see clients that do EMDR, but I also get to do psychotherapy with them. So I get to maybe take in their anxiety, maybe take in their depression scores. And it's interesting to just see the effects of EMDR. I think it's one of those modalities that you get to see results like very, very clear. And so it really does help a lot of clients. And it's been interesting to sort of see that dynamic, to see that impact of EMDR on patients, especially your clients, sorry, especially after seeing them deal with traumatic events that really impact them, to see something that really is able to help them out. Um, I would like to hear your perspectives from it, but it sounds like it's a modality that helps clients in a faster way. That's kind of how I kind of see it. So I would like to hear maybe your perspective since you're the ones that kind of work with the clients in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that I think that talking about trauma in particular can be really difficult because we have a tendency to get really activated, right? And we know that when this danger signal is going off in our brains, like the logical part of our brain goes offline, right? Like, so we don't have access to that. And also, like, that part of our brain that controls our speech, we might not be able to talk, right? And so EMDR can be really helpful in moving clients through that, um, without necessarily getting into the details or doing a whole lot of talking. Um,
Right. And oftentimes I think what comes up for me, as you're saying, that is sometimes we don't necessarily have the language, nor do we recognize that there is like a sensation or something that we have to label. So through EMDR, then that actually is accessed. So I just want to go back. I don't want to lose. I know I can go back and forth. So what the heck is EMDR then? Noticing the leaves falling, and you're talking about accessing memories and physiological sensations that may actually be tied and linked to traumatic experiences, or even experiences that we don't think are traumatic sometimes, are actually stored in our bodies, and EMDR really helps through that. I see you both noting.
Yeah. And it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, right? Which basically means, and it doesn't always use eye movement, right? Sometimes it's tapping on, your shoulders while you're crossing your arms, or sometimes it's like they'll use pulsars in some places where you have like thing in one
tactile
hand. Yeah, totally.
Buzzers, yeah.
Yeah.
Or like auditory.
Or audio.
Audio, yeah. And it helps. I mean, I think it might be helpful to kind of talk about what does it even feel like to be in an EMDR session, right? Because I think it's kind of like this, this is different, right? I'm not just talking about it. So what is this?
Yeah. I'm okay to share some of that. So I've actually first learned about EMDR being a client myself. I didn't know what it was. I heard people say EMDR works great, but I'm like, okay, sure, let's just give it a try. And being a client, I actually went in because I was having some panic attacks. I had like just very reactive symptoms to the loss of a close friend. And I was paralyzed. And I couldn't write, I couldn't process, I couldn't sleep. I was like highly anxious. So through EMDR, while we go through this, I always tell people it's very organized, and in not necessarily a very organized way, but it is. So you find ways and things that are very grounding, so that you understand that you have a safe place to go to if you need to. I mean, you can be calm if you have to come back to yourself. But through eye movement, which is what they used with me in treatment, I had on one side, I had my safe place, which for some reason it came up to be my grandma and my best friend kind of just looking at me. It was like such a bizarre, like, joining of experiences because they didn't know each other. And I was a little kid. But that was a safe memory. And then I was reprocessing the loss at the same time. So through bilateral movement, what they do is like they help you integrate left brain, right brain memories, and you organize it and reprocess it. And then the desensitization piece is that you're not going to be so reactive when you think about the loss. For me, that was the loss that I had. So it was not a very adaptive, we would call it adaptive way of managing life. Like, right, I'm not going to lose everybody suddenly because I lost a friend. I'm like grieving the loss of a friend, but this doesn't mean that life is over for everyone. So I don't have to go around carrying that fear, because now I can actually grieve in a more adaptive way, like feel my emotions, don't get paralyzed, don't be like so deep and into my own grief and sadness. It's more of I'm here now, I can feel my grief, and there is like moving forward. So that was kind of like my experience. And I was so amazed by the quick results. It was really quick. I don't know. Yeah.
I think that you bring up an important point about like what is happening with you, right? Because the part of our brain that processes emotion, and then right, like that biographical data
Yes.
fact collecting part. When we experience trauma, sometimes things don't kind of like integrate to get stored right in our memory. The trauma gets trapped in our body, right? And so it's really interesting that while maybe a client came in for this one particular issue, well, when they're doing the reprocessing, all of these other seemingly unrelated things come up, right? But it doesn't have to necessarily be things surrounding just this one thing. It could be a feeling, right? So I have this emotion that is tied to this, but a very similar emotion is tied to all of these other experiences in my life, right? So clients can come in for this one thing, but find out that they are experiencing healing on like myriad levels.
Many layers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, Dr. Yamilko, you touched on how in the earlier stages, you're working on building resources so that if you have stuff that's kind of coming up between sessions that's overwhelming for you, you have something to lean on. You have tools to kind of go back to help you find like feel safe emotionally and logically. And then sometimes it's like people will come in because they're like, I feel really stuck around this area. Or sometimes it's like a very specific trauma. Or sometimes it's like this trauma that happened over years. Right.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes you start in the process by finding like what is that initial memory, that earliest memory that kind of builds into the other ones. And sometimes, like you were saying, Dr. Laura, that like you will start with one memory and then it organically will kind of integrate these other memories that are connected to it. Like if you're processing child abuse, for example, in your childhood, then you might be processing this one early memory and then it might integrate other memories that kind of naturally happen. And other times you process a memory and then you go on to the next memory and then, so it can be really unique for each individual.
Yeah, I've had clients actually go back to like pre-verbal times and reprocess that, and that was really interesting. Like as a clinician, to be a part of that experience, because this person was like, God, I want to say like in their 40s or 50s, right? And I can't even remember some days like what I had for breakfast, right? And so to go like all the way back to like decades to remember this one piece that just was such a stuck point for them, like this like abandonment, right? That they experienced, and this very vivid image that they have like decades later. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And I think too, when you're in the session, right, I think it might be helpful to break down that piece too a little bit more, because it's like you're not talking about it, so what? So it's usually like a set of 30 seconds or so where you're doing some form of bilateral stimulation, and then the therapist will say, what are you noticing? And then you give like a snapshot of what's coming up for you. Sometimes
and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Right? Which is for me like why it's really important to like let clients know what to expect. Like, yeah, a lot of this is going to sound really repetitive, and there's a reason for that. Yeah. Because otherwise, if I didn't know that, I'd be like, why do you just keep repeating yourself?
Yeah.
Can you say something different, please?
Yeah. And when you're used to like having a therapist validate what you're saying or reflect back what they're hearing from you, I mean, as a therapist, that felt weird to get used to doing that. And I think it's probably strange for clients a lot of the time too. Yeah. And there's something too about that bilateral stimulation where they're like, we know it works, we're not really sure why, right? And I mean, we know that our eyes move when we're in REM sleep.
Yeah, I can mimic some of that kind of process, and we're doing that while we're awake with a client. Yet, like, what else?
Yeah.
People, one thing that often comes up for people is, are you hypnotizing me? Like, are you sure you're not hypnotizing me? And I always actually now, from the beginning, when I'm providing education about what, EMDR is and why we use the bilateral stimulation, I let people know I am not trained in hypnosis. I don't know how to hypnotize. I assure you that is not what I'm doing. It's just part now of my consent, because it's just very strange, right? And they're like, am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? And just kind of like normalizing. I feel like there is, even though we're not doing much talk therapy, I still find important to kind of normalize the experience of, you're really not doing anything wrong. There is no right or wrong, other than just following this and allowing the process to any thoughts, any feelings, any physical sensations. I just notice that. So when I asked you to take a deep breath and let it go, and what do you notice, that's usually what I want to know.
Right.
Yeah. So we can actually bring that back and integrate and make sense of, and then we repeat.
Yeah. And I guess one of the pieces of the theory of EMDR, right, is that we have trauma symptoms because, like you were talking about, Dr. Laura, that we haven't fully integrated a traumatic experience or memory. And so it helps your brain to make those connections to integrate that memory. So your brain's not trying to like brace for it happening again, or doesn't still happening. There's an element of trauma that feels like it's ongoing, even when you're not in a traumatic experience.
Right. And the predictability piece of kind of like getting into this rhythm of what Dr. Yamilka was saying is really important. There's something that is soothing about that, right? Is when we're dealing with trauma, letting people know what to expect, kind of like what I mentioned before, is so important. And so like one of the benefits of being trained in EMDR is like we have to go through it ourselves, right? Like that's part of it. And so from an experiential piece, like I can explain to the clients, like, have you ever like been to Disneyland and been on the Star Tours ride? Right. And like when you're going into hyper, what is it, hyper speed? Or yeah, I forget all of words, Laura. Right. It kind of can feel like that sometimes, where it's like you're like getting like sucked into this really interesting place. And the first time that I experienced that, I was like, what the heck is that? So letting the clients know, like, hey, this is really common. You may experience this also. Like, yeah, if you're yawning, go ahead and yawn like a really big, exaggerated yawn, right? Because that is going to help stimulate your vagus nerve. And so again, like predictability and letting clients know what to expect is such an important part of this process, I think.
I think that in itself is soothing, and it's almost like I say it like I'm actually walking with you. Like I always tell them, I will let you know what's coming up next.
Yeah.
I'll let you know that next session, this is where we may start, this is where we may be, unless something shifts and changes. I'll let them know we meet today, but 3 days from now, your brain is still reprocessing information. So if you have dreams that feel very vivid, don't be terrified. This is part of the process. If you notice yourself being more calm or more emotional, is still also your brain trying to make sense and reprocess and organize. If we have fragmented memories, we're trying to like bring those together and organize. So your brain is doing a lot of work for 3 days, even 3 days after we meet. So they'll be
Right.
surprised. And I think that really helps people with that, like you're saying, what to expect.
I think there's something about the weirdness that helps people's protective mechanisms and protective parts to kind of step back too. And there's it's like you're not trying to think yourself through it, right? You're trying to like relax into the process. So I think it helps processing happen at a deeper level. And oftentimes I think the ways that we're protecting ourselves or our protective parts can get a bit stuck or gridlocked, right? And how they're trying to protect you, that can create this stuckness, right? And I think that's what you were talking about, Vanessa, where you sometimes you can see clients feel really stuck around their anxiety, and then kind of in the process they're able to like move through that. And yeah, it's definitely fascinating for sure.
Very fascinating to kind of see that. Different from psychotherapy, where we are kind of talking about the problem or maybe discussing some other stuff. It's more talking, right? And with this one, it sounds like it's more about building safety and reprocessing to continue building that safety. I'm curious, what kind of clients do you all think are a good fit for EMDR? Like, what would make a client be like, okay, EMDR is a type of modality that is probably going to serve me better than maybe just psychotherapy?
Question. I think for me, I often will have clients seek me out because they want EMDR, right? It's usually when clients are looking for that, it's either that they're feeling really stuck in an area, or they're wanting to process a trauma, whether that was one traumatic event or a series of traumatic events.
Right. And like it doesn't have to be like, oh, I was in a car accident, or oh, like I grew up in an abusive household. Like being a queer person in many places in the world is not safe, or having another marginalized identity. We experience all of these like microaggressions and like chronic invalidation, right? And so we get these experiences, we have these experiences like over and over and over and over. And it can be like water dripping on a rock, right? Where like one drop probably not going to do anything, but when you have over and over and over again, it will wear its way through a rock. And so like that chronic invalidation, the chronic like living in a state of like chronic like hyper vigilance is like walking around with your nervous system on fire all the time. And so EMDR, I think can be incredible. And because I work so much with these, like this population, it can be so incredibly helpful in moving through things that this is just the way that life is. We might not even realize how deeply that it's affecting us. And we just know that maybe we feel really anxious all the time, or maybe we feel really depressed, or maybe like we're having nightmares, or a variety of other symptoms, and we can't really understand why. And EMDR can be really helpful in addressing that. That was a lot of words. Sorry.
I love that you brought that up, because I feel like discrimination, even bullying, right? Like any form of like feeling othered and rejected in some way, right? Whether that's socially or by your family. And sometimes that's covert and like not so obvious. And sometimes that's really obvious. And yeah, it affects not only your ability to feel safe in the world, but your ability to feel like you are a valid, lovable human.
Right. And people understand like, oh, well, you were in a car accident. Yeah, that's traumatic. But growing up being like chronically invalidated, or having emotionally immature or narcissistic parents, like people don't really consider that oftentimes as traumatic. And it can be so much more difficult to treat. right? The longer and the more experiences of trauma, it just like grows into this big, tangled mess. And it can take time to kind of start unraveling that. And EMDR can be really helpful in calming the nervous system enough for us to start doing that.
Yeah. It's kind of like liberating yourself from all these layers of, or like the mask that I call, so you can bring your true self. I also feel like, or I think like the migration experience for some people, sometimes people may not necessarily see that as traumatic, or, you know, there are some migrating, experiences that are traumatic, but some other ones may be seen as, oh yeah, you just moved. For some, there is like a loss of like nationality or like identity that is kind of like tied into what you're saying. And just that in itself can create like that feeling of otherness, or not belonging, or not feeling like you can be true to your own cultural background or self. And I feel like those actually come up.
And it's tricky, right? People don't even consider that.
No. Sometimes what I've heard some people say is they use the word splitting, or you're splitting. And I'm like, it's not really splitting. Like, these humans are actually battling with grief. It's really grief from like the loss, or feeling like stuck between two places and you really don't belong here or there. That makes it really difficult in processing some of that through EMDR. And sometimes, again, you don't have the words for it. It's more like a felt sense. So I do actually a lot of somatic work with EMDR, especially when people struggle and they get stuck with their logical, like the cognitions. I ask people to come back to their bodies, and they may feel like, okay, what are you doing? I'm like, there's a good reason for that. Some of what you're thinking of, some of that experience is actually in your body and stuck. So I do a lot of like scanning, and where do you sense that? Shoulders, stomach, chest, arms. And it really is really helpful.
I think you bring up a really important point too, Dr. Emilka, that trauma is not universal, right? For some people, they can go through a car accident and it isn't a traumatic experience. And for other people, it's tremendously traumatic, right? Or migration, or, you know, like, and I think part of that, right, is not only, sometimes we it's a protective mechanism to even like minimize the trauma that you experience, right? So you might not even want to look at it as trauma. You might think to yourself, like, I had a wonderful childhood, when in reality, you had a parent that's a narcissist, or, you know, like, and I think also, you know, it begs the question, like, what is trauma, right? And yeah, and I think, you know, I learned in that trauma and crisis intervention, right? It's trauma is, it overwhelms your resources, and that's so different based off of each person, right? If you have a wonderful, securely attached community, then your resources are a lot more vast, and you have places to process what you have gone through or what you're going through. Whereas if you're really isolated and alone, and your sense of safety is already fragile, it's a lot smaller.
So like, what is the difference between a distressing event and trauma, right? Because lots, like everyone experiences distressing events, but some people that develops into trauma, and for other people it doesn't, right? And it's not the distressing event that creates the trauma, it's dealing with that alone. And having that resourcing that you were just talking about, Rosie, I think is so incredibly important. And going to what Dr. Yamilka was saying, talking about like migration, you're in a new place, you don't necessarily have that support system built up, especially if you're moving somewhere by yourself, right? Like many people will go and try and find a job and get established, and then later like bring their families I know that's something that happens frequently. So you're going from this place with all of these resources to this place where I don't know anybody. I might not really know the language. I don't know how to navigate all of these new different systems, and that's very different than going into a place and having those resources.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. What's coming up for Vanessa? I'm curious.
Or just listening over trauma populations, just how different it is for some people interested in this aspect of EMDR versus psychotherapy. And when we're thinking about maybe minorities or immigrant populations, or even when we're talking about queer populations, that feeling of maybe feeling alone, maybe not knowing how to talk maybe about our feelings, maybe knowing how to express ourselves or even ask for help or even being able to receive it, and how EMDR could be a good possibility for people because it offers them a place to have that safety, to build that safety that maybe we all need, right? We all deserve, and to be able to expand that, to be able to process that, how helpful it is for this modality to be used with people at times when we have such difficulties being able to even talk about the problems. So option.
Which is, you bring back again what we have mentioned already, but it's the beauty of the modalities that we resource people. We help people find like what resources do you have before we tap onto like reprocessing or even talking about the traumatic experiences or distressing events. Like it's just very important. It's really sad sometimes for me when people don't have like real, or whenever they experience life as not having real resources. And clearly we imagine and we create spaces where they feel like they have the resources they need, which is also wonderful because you can help people kind of lift up and create a place where they feel seen, validated, safe, calm. But anyway, it just touches on what you're saying, all of you, like the importance of feeling that resource or community. Yeah.
I know that for everyone is different, but I'm curious as to how long does it usually take to do the therapy? How long would it take to build that safety, to build those resources and be able to do the reprocessing? What's the lengthwise for the EMDR?
Yeah.
That question.
I'm like, you answer the question, Vanessa. It's such a tough question because it is different for everyone. Sometimes I've resourced people, I've done psychoeducation, resource in session 1, and maybe do a target. I always quote target assessment, meaning we go into what are we going to reprocess by second session. Sometimes I've taken like 8 sessions and I can't finish resourcing.
Right. When someone doesn't have a sense of safety in the world, that can take a lot longer, right? And if they don't have, if you're trying to help them find a way to feel safe and they're like, but I'm not, and the world's not safe, right? It can take a lot longer.
Yeah.
And sometimes even just spending all the time that they need trying to find safety, trying to find a way to, whether that's psychologically feeling safe or even just kind of allowing your central nervous system to find a sense of safety through tools or breathing exercises. Like sometimes that takes a long time. And other times it's like really quick and you spend one session in resources and then you're on to the next, right? It's just,
I think that the more more trauma that somebody has experienced can make it more difficult. It can take a longer amount of time because remember how I was saying that, well, maybe this feeling, this body sensation or this emotion is connected to this and connected to this and connected to this. And so sometimes it can take a lot longer.
Yeah. My own experiencing, I'm not saying this is, I'm not quoting research or anything like that, but my own experience working with people in EMDR is that like single traumatic events, or even if it's like complex trauma, sometimes it really depends on the context in which the trauma has happened that helps you move from one stage or other. When it comes to systemic issues, like when the trauma is from like societal, my experience is that it's harder to get someone to come to this place of, I'm feeling safe enough now to start working. So the resourcing takes longer. I don't know if I'm making sense. This is my own experience. I'm not quoting research.
Right. And one of the ways that I work with that is I pull from tenets of the gender minority stress model, which really there's a big emphasis on resilience. And I think that that can apply to any marginalized population, right? Where just you have inherent resilience, just, you know, as a person going through life, experiencing what you're experiencing, and you're still moving forward. And also you can find resources in your own community, whether that be like if you're trans, like you might find pride and connection in the trans community. Maybe you're religious, you know, maybe in your religious institution and those connections, or if you are a member of the global majority, you know, tying in with resources that you are going to find other people
communal resources where they feel actually safe.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes that can be harder, like for people in larger bodies, like it's harder to find community and safety because a lot of people in larger bodies have a lot of internalized fat phobia, where just because someone else is fat doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be safe as a fat person with them, right? Like it doesn't.
But so you're bringing a good point. It's like, how do you actually experience the community? Because like, you know, I love what you're saying, both of you. And it's like, we can work on resourcing, which is why it takes longer sometimes. And we'll work on that. But do you actually feel that there is safety even within your community or identified community? Which I think those are the cases where I'm saying is a bit harder to like start the process because you spend more time resourcing.
Yeah, and if you have lots of intersections of identity, you find some level of safety in the queer community, but then you experience a lot of weight stigma, for example, or you know, there's a lot of ways that a community might not necessarily be it for you.
This has been a wonderful conversation. What the heck is EMDR? We've been wanting to talk about this for some time because we do use it. I mean, I use it every day, mostly. So it's nice. Yeah.
We could do a whole episode on trauma too, because there's just like so much.
What is trauma?
Do like a whole series,
right? Or some people may say, I don't have trauma, and it's because they don't experience it as trauma, even though one example, I don't want to get into it because I know our time is up. It's like some people are so worried about hurricanes. I love the storms. Some people experience them as traumatic. For me, it's like, as long as I have shutters and I'm like closed, I want the winds, I want the rain. I am like all about it. And for some people, it's like, where do I run to? They experience them as very different.
Yeah. And it might trigger other traumas too. You know, or even if you're trying to convince yourself, maybe unconsciously, that it's not a trauma, there might be deeper parts of it that are like traumatic. I don't know.
another episode. Okay, thanks everyone, and until next time.
Bye.